Let me tell you about the audacity of a woman who leaves her 3-year-old son, vanishes for 20 years, then returns with a lawyer and a fresh blowout, claiming to be a concerned mother. I lived it. If you think you know how this ends, you don't. In the world of silence and violin wood, real sound isn't in what is spoken aloud. In my position, would you have stayed quiet to observe, or would you have forced her out of your life immediately? The wood never lies if you listen closely enough. I was 53 years old, hunched over a 17th century cello in my workshop on the Massachusetts coast, when the door chime broke my concentration. The air in my shop usually tastes of aged spruce, maple, and the sharp, clean bite of spirit varnish. It is a sanctuary built on thousands of hours of meticulous, invisible labour. But as the man in the charcoal suit stepped inside, he brought with him the scent of expensive cologne and the static energy of a life lived in 6-minute increments. He didn't look like someone who appreciated the resonance of an F-hole or the delicate balance of a bass bar. He looked like an audit. He handed me a thick, cream-coloured envelope without a word. If I am being honest, I already knew what was inside before I broke the seal. Some forms of trouble have a specific weight. I wiped the wood dust from my hands onto my apron and pulled out the documents. Heather. My ex-wife had been a ghost for over 2 decades, a silent account I had written off long ago. Now, she was suddenly very vocal. She was petitioning for guardianship over our son Nathan's estate, specifically the acoustic patents he had developed, which were currently valued at $5,800,000. The legal language was precise, cold, and utterly detached from reality. She alleged that I was restricting Nathan's autonomy and mismanaging his intellectual property for my own gain. It was a calculated strike against my character, designed to frame me as a predator in my own home. In my line of work, you learn that silence is the most important tool you possess. When you are restoring a masterwork, you don't force the wood. You wait for it to tell you where the tension is. I did not yell. I did not even look up at the man, waiting for a reaction. I just placed the papers on my workbench, next to a bottle of hide glue and a fine-toothed saw. Looking back now, I realise I had been the silent investor in Heather's version of family for years, footing every emotional and financial bill while she accrued interest on her own absence. She called herself a concerned mother in paragraph 4. It was a luxury she had overdrafted for decades, and now she was trying to leverage Nathan's genius to balance her own books. I looked out the window toward the back garden, where Nathan was seated near the old oak tree, his ears covered by thick grey headphones, his world perfectly calibrated and free of her noise. I turned back to the lawyer. She says she is concerned, I said, my voice as flat as a planed board. But tell me, where has she been for the last 7,300 days? The man didn't answer. He just nodded politely and left, the door chime ringing out like a discordant note in a symphony I had spent 20 years trying to perfect. Heather thought she was starting a war. I knew she was just exposing the first major crack in her own foundation. Memory is the most persistent form of resonance. Looking back now, the day Nathan was diagnosed in 2002 remains, as vivid as a fresh coat of lacquer. He was only 2 years old. While other parents were measuring milestones, we were being handed a map to a territory Heather had no intention of exploring. To her, Nathan wasn't a son. He was a defective product that had ruined her investment in a perfect future. I could see her emotional withdrawal in the quiet moments, the way she stopped reaching for his hand, the way she looked through him, as if he were part of the scenery she no longer liked. She did not announce her exit. She just ceased to participate. One Tuesday morning, when Nathan was 3, she kissed my cheek and said she was running to the local market for milk. She never came back. She left with a man from her office, leaving behind a child who spent the next 5 days sitting by the front window, waiting for a car that had already crossed the state line. I will not describe the sound Nathan made during those nights. Some frequencies are too painful to record. If I am being honest, I think a part of me stayed in that hallway for 20 years, waiting for the screaming to stop. I had been the silent partner in our marriage, but suddenly I was the sole proprietor of a life I was not prepared to lead. I worked carpentry during the daylight hours, my hands growing calloused and stained with walnut dust. At night, I traded the chisel for a notebook, studying sensory processing and the mechanics of sound. It took me years to understand that Nathan was not silent. He was simply broadcasting on a band that required absolute stillness to hear. I became his translator. I learned the exact way his blanket needed to be folded to provide the pressure he required to feel grounded. If I missed it by an inch, sleep was not an option for either of us. At the time, I did not realize I was crafting a sanctuary. I thought I was just surviving. Our life was a subscription to a version of family where I was the only one footing the bill, and Heather had overdrafted on our compassion for 3 years before she finally closed the account. I spent those early years lying on the floor outside his bedroom door, matching my breathing to his, so he could find a rhythm in the chaos of his own mind. I was building an invisible fortress around us, a place where the noise of the outside world could not penetrate. It took me years to understand that some forms of dependence stay invisible until you stop cooperating with the people who hurt you. We lived in a world where we did not need to speak because we understood the subtext of every vibration in the house. I was teaching Nathan how to hear the truth hidden within the grain of a violin. I had no idea that he was quietly learning how to hear the truth hidden within the lies she was about to tell. Public perception is a malleable medium. Heather understood how to manipulate a narrative long before I had even finished reading her first legal filing. She didn't just wait for the news to find her. She hired a boutique PR firm to seed a human interest story on social media. She framed it as a mother's desperate search for her stolen son, making the narrative so viral that local news outlets had no choice but to follow the noise. Within 72 hours, the local Massachusetts papers were already running headlines about a reclusive artisan, allegedly isolating a vulnerable genius. She did not lead with a demand for the $5,800,000. She led with a performance of maternal grief so polished it would have been at home on a Broadway stage. I saw her on the 6 o'clock news, sitting in a studio with lighting designed to erase the 20 years she had been gone. She wore a navy suit and a strand of pearls. My mother's pearls, the ones that had been missing from the jewellery box since the day she left for the grocery store in 2002. She was selling a narrative where she was the primary shareholder in Nathan's life, and I was merely a hostile manager who had overstayed his welcome. Looking back now, I can see the clinical nature of her plan. Those with narcissistic tendencies often believe that giving life is a perpetual contract for ownership. She did not see Nathan as a man with his own agency. She saw him as an asset that had finally matured, and she was here to collect the dividends. It was a luxury of entitlement she had overdrafted for decades, and now she was attempting to use the public's empathy to balance her books. The escalation was swift. She leaked a grainy video from 2005, a moment when Nathan was 7 years old and having a severe sensory crisis. In the footage, he was screaming on the floor while I stood nearby, trying to keep him safe without triggering further sensory overload. Out of context, it looked like a nightmare. Heather used it to suggest that I was incapable of managing his well-being, arguing that his fragility required the oversight of a mother's intuition. She was targeting the Stewart Sound patents, the acoustic mapping technology Nathan had built to find the perfect frequencies in wood restoration. At the time, I did not realize that Heather's noise was actually a tactical advantage. In my workshop, I know that a violin with a hidden crack will always reveal itself when you hit a certain frequency. Heather was broadcasting on a frequency of pure desperation, but she was masking it with the language of concern. She thought her campaign would force me into a defensive crouch. She assumed that my silence was a sign of fear, or perhaps a lack of evidence to the contrary. If I am being honest, I felt a flicker of the old anger, but it was cold and controlled, a precision tool rather than a wildfire. I watched her on that screen, crying for a son whose middle name she probably couldn't even remember. She thought she was winning the war for public opinion by being the loudest person in the room. She did not know that in the world of sound engineering, the most devastating signals are often the ones you never hear coming. The conference room at the lawyer's office smelled of expensive paper and cold air. Heather sat across from me, surrounded by 4 attorneys and thick stacks of files. She pushed a joint guardianship agreement across the polished glass table, demanding access to 50% of the value of Nathan's $5,800,000 patents. Her legal strategy was surgical. She wasn't claiming Nathan lacked intelligence. She was filing for a limited conservatorship, alleging that his sensory processing disorder made him a vulnerable target for my undue influence. She framed my protective workshop as a cage, arguing that I had isolated a brilliant mind to harvest his wealth for myself. She conveniently ignored that our workshop was a federally registered laboratory, fully compliant with ADA standards for neurodivergent professionals. My cage was actually a high-tech facility, providing the exact sensory accommodations Nathan needed to function at 100% capacity. Her lawyer, Patricia Dunn, smiled mechanically, saying this was the last chance to settle in peace before they took the matter before a judge. She emphasized that courts often tend to prioritize the biological connection between mother and child, especially when the mother has recovered her financial and psychological standing. If I had been the man of 10 years ago, perhaps I would have shouted, but 10 years of restoring violins has taught me that true strength is not in pressure, but in precision. Gary Pullman, my lawyer, leaned in and whispered a harsh reality. Although I had raised him for 20 years, the law still leaves a narrow door for biological rights, and if Heather could prove she was prevented from accessing him in the past, we would be in major trouble. This was a point of real friction I could not ignore. Nathan sat next to me, his noise-cancelling headphones still tight against his ears. He seemed to be in another universe, his left hand tucked into his hoodie pocket, his right hand holding an old Parker ballpoint pen. During the entire 3-hour negotiation, he did not say a single word, only occasionally glancing at Heather through his thick glasses. Heather tried to call his name in the sweet, fake tone she had practiced on television, but Nathan remained as silent as a piece of ancient heartwood. The truth often lies in the spaces between the lies. When Heather's lawyer began lecturing about the sacred right of bloodline, I saw Nathan open his black notebook. He wrote a small line and then pushed it gently toward me. Frequency error, 2011. That number made my blood run cold. I realized Nathan was not sitting there aimlessly. He was conducting an acoustic audit of his mother. I looked into Heather's eyes and saw the greed lurking behind the expensive makeup. She thought she held control of the board because she had bloodline and a strong legal team. But she had forgotten a critical thing. My son does not see the world in images. He sees the world in logical signals that cannot be faked. Heather had banked on the fact that our old records were private, but she underestimated the power of the legal discovery process. By filing this suit, she had inadvertently opened her own dark history to a forensic audit, and Nathan's signals were about to point the court exactly where the bodies were buried. Nathan closed the notebook with a dry click that echoed in the silent room. My son closed the notebook. It was the sound of a trap being sprung. The air in the room didn't just chill, it solidified. Heather's lawyers were still talking about reconnection and reparations, but I was already looking back at the winter of 2011. That was the year a freak storm flooded my first workshop, ruining 10 valuable spruce tops and nearly bankrupting my business. It was also the only time Heather had ever reached out before now. Looking back now, I realize I had been a naive curator of a history she had already set on fire. Heather did not come back then to check on Nathan's progress, or to see if he still needed the weighted blankets she had once called too much trouble. She came back because she realized our 2005 default divorce decree had a dormant loophole regarding unforeseen future assets. My lawyer at the time hadn't permanently terminated her potential interest in my intellectual property, leaving a narrow window she was now desperate to exploit. She wanted $50,000 to sign a permanent waiver of guardianship. We executed the transaction through a notarized settlement agreement, officially coded as a buyout of her remaining equity in our marital estate. It was a high price for a piece of paper, but it ensured that both the IRS and the probate court would see the transaction as a closed business matter, not a personal bribe. At the time, I did not realize how high the stakes were. I borrowed that $50,000 at an interest rate that felt like an amputation just to ensure she would never have the legal authority to disturb Nathan's world again. I thought I was buying his freedom. Heather had signed the relinquishment of parental interests form with a gold pen, barely glancing at the child, sitting 10 feet away in the hallway, testing a new set of binaural microphones. If I am being honest, the guilt of not telling Nathan about that meeting had gnawed at me for over a decade. But as the lawyers continued their performance, Nathan slowly reached into his bag and pulled out a small professional-grade audio recorder. In Massachusetts, recording someone without consent is a legal minefield. But Nathan's device wasn't a spy tool. It was a prescribed sensory monitor, a medical necessity he used to log environmental frequencies that triggered his meltdowns. My lawyer, Gary, caught my eye and nodded under these specific circumstances. The recording was an objective medical log, and it was about to impeach Heather's testimony with devastating precision. He did not ask for permission. He just pressed a button. The voice that filled the high-end office was unmistakably Heather's, but stripped of its current concerned mother frequency. It was the sound of a woman closing a business deal. "He's a liability, Elijah." The younger Heather's voice rang out, crisp and devoid of resonance. "I want the $50,000 so I can start a life that does not involve constant noise. Sign the papers, give me the cash, and you won't hear from me again. He won't even know I was here." Heather's face didn't just go pale, it lost its structure. She looked like a masterwork that had just suffered a catastrophic structural failure. Nathan sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the recorder as if analysing the waveform of her betrayal. It took me years to understand that while I was protecting his childhood, Nathan was archiving the truth. He had recorded that conversation when he was only 13 years old, not because he was vindictive, but because the frequency of her deceit was a noise he could not filter out. Heather's lead lawyer, Patricia Dunn, stopped mid-sentence, her fountain pen hovering over a legal pad like a needle on a broken record. "Is that authentic?" Patricia asked, her voice finally losing its 6-minute increment polish. I did not answer. I just looked at Heather. This was not an emotional outburst. It was an accounting. Justice is not a scream. It is a perfectly calibrated frequency. In the closed courtroom in Salem, the air felt as heavy as unvarnished ebony. Heather's lawyer, Patricia Dunn, attempted a desperate pivot, calling the recording a digital fabrication, a deepfake designed to target a grieving mother's reputation. If I am being honest, I expected the resistance. In restoration, when you find a rotten section of wood, the surrounding structure will often fight to hold the decay in place before it finally gives way. Nathan did not look at his mother as she sat, trembling, in the gallery. He stood up and unrolled a sheet of paper that looked more like a technical schematic than a witness statement. He did not talk about his feelings. He spoke about hertz and decibels. He explained to the court that the background noise in the recording matched the resonant frequency of my old workshop's industrial ventilation system, a system that had been replaced in 2012. He provided a side-by-side comparison of the audio waves. He was not just a witness, He was the clinical auditor of her betrayal. Looking back now, I realise that justice is rarely about a dramatic gavel strike. It is about the moment the noise stops and the truth becomes the only sound left in the room. Judge Carol Whitfield did not need to hear another word. Judge Whitfield recognised that the recording, while captured as a sensory aid, served as undeniable proof of perjury. Heather had sworn under oath that she never traded her son for money. The audio didn't just contradict her, it exposed a fundamental fraud against the court's integrity. She looked at Heather with the same expression I use when I find a violin that has been intentionally damaged by a careless owner. The ruling was immediate and final. The petition for guardianship was dismissed with prejudice. Heather was ordered to pay the legal fees for both parties and was hit with heavy Rule 11 sanctions for filing a frivolous, bad-faith lawsuit. The judge ordered her to pay damages for the attempted fraud against the estate, a sum that would likely liquidate whatever asset she had managed to claw together over the last decade. But the financial loss was not the real consequence. It was the total collapse of her narrative. The press, which she had weaponized so effectively a week earlier, was already drafting headlines about her fraud and the 20 years of neglect she had tried to hide. Heather did not cry this time. She just sat there, staring at her folded hands, realizing that the burden she had tried to sell for $50,000 in 2011 had just bankrupted her entire existence. Nathan put his recorder back in his bag and adjusted his headphones, returning to a world where her noise no longer existed. We had achieved absolute structural integrity. Heather stood in the lobby, a ghost in an expensive coat, as the doors of our real life finally closed on her noise. The silence in my workshop has a different quality now. It is no longer the silence of a fortress under siege, but the pure, resonant quiet of a completed masterwork. Heather's social and financial account was liquidated by the very reality she spent 2 decades trying to ignore. It took me years to understand that true justice is not a loud, cinematic event. It is a quiet recalibration of the ledger. We did not seek to destroy her. We simply conducted a final audit of her absence, and she found herself naturally insolvent. Heather is still out there, I suppose, living in the bankruptcy of her own making. Looking back now, I recognize that her greatest mistake wasn't just leaving, it was assuming that the world would always accept her superficial performance over our lived reality. She is currently navigating a mountain of legal debts and the complete loss of the status she prized above all else. In the high society circles of Massachusetts, her name is now synonymous with a specific kind of predatory fraud. But in this workshop, we no longer track her currency. Her noise has been filtered out of our broadcast permanently. Nathan and I have repurposed the capital from the Stewart Sound patents to establish the Eleanor Sound Initiative. If I'm being honest, I think this is what the patents were always meant for. We have opened a vocational school and research centre for young adults on the spectrum, a place where they can learn the technical mechanics of sound and woodcraft without the sensory chaos of the traditional world. Nathan does not just own the building. He designs the frequencies of the rooms. He ensures that every student has a space where they can be heard without ever having to raise their voice. This was never about revenge for us. This was about accounting. We took the $5,800,000 and the residual grief of 20 years and converted them into a legacy that actually builds something. Some people call it a victory. I call it the justice of the sower. While Heather was busy trying to harvest a crop she never planted, Nathan and I were quietly tending to the soil. We learned that a family isn't a contract of DNA, it is a conscious, daily investment of presence. It is the person who stays when the sound is unbearable, and the one who waits outside the door just to hear you breathe. To those of you sitting in the quiet right now, feeling like you are an outsider in your own story, I want you to hear me clearly. Do not be afraid of your silence. Do not be afraid of the years you spend doing the invisible work while others take the credit. Some forms of power stay invisible until the moment the noise stops. You are not a worthless burden or a liability. You are a master artisan in the middle of a very long, very difficult restoration. If you have spent your life being overlooked or dismissed by the people who were supposed to protect you, remember this: your worth is not determined by their ability to perceive it. They are the ones with the limited frequency range, not you. Build your sanctuary, protect your world. And when the time comes to speak, do not shout. Just show them the evidence of your survival. The truth has a resonance that requires no embellishment. It took me years to understand that the man who stayed and the boy who listened were always more than enough. Nathan's first framed frequency map, the one of the Atlantic waves hitting the shore near our home, remains the center of our world. It is a reminder that we stopped waiting for a phantom to return, and in doing so, we found the only family that ever mattered. I'd like to hear your perspective. Have you ever had to find the courage to cut a toxic tie and build your own version of a family? How did you find your resonance in the noise?